The ancient stone walls of Thornfield Manor stood like silent sentinels against the Scottish countryside, their weathered surfaces telling stories of centuries past. On this crisp October afternoon, the estate buzzed with activity as the Reed family gathered to celebrate Aunt Carol's 60th birthday. The manicured gardens, ablaze with autumn colours, provided a picture-perfect backdrop for what would become a defining moment in one young woman's life. Ellie Reed stepped out of her 15-year-old Ford Focus, the car door creaking in protest as she closed it with perhaps more force than necessary. The sound seemed embarrassingly loud against the backdrop of purring BMWs, sleek Mercedes, and her cousin Marcus's brand-new Tesla Model S. She pulled her worn wool coat tighter around her shoulders, the same charcoal grey coat she'd owned since university, its edges slightly frayed but still functional. At 29, Ellie possessed the kind of understated beauty that often went unnoticed in a room full of people trying to impress each other. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup save for a touch of mascara that emphasized her green eyes. Her dress, a simple navy blue number from a high street shop, was clean and pressed but unremarkable. No designer labels, no expensive jewelry, no carefully curated accessories that screamed success. The contrast with her arriving relatives was stark. Her sister Julie emerged from a gleaming Range Rover, her blonde hair professionally styled, wearing what Ellie recognized as a designer dress that probably cost more than Ellie's rent for 2 months. Julie's husband, Simon, a successful corporate lawyer, was helping their 2 children out of the car while checking his Apple Watch, even at a family gathering unable to fully disconnect from the demands of his high-powered career. Cousin Marcus, 35, and a managing director at an investment firm in London, had arrived with his wife Penelope, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. Penelope's handbag alone probably cost what Ellie made in a good month of freelance work. Their twin boys, dressed in matching blazers that cost more than most people's weekly salaries, were already running toward the manor's imposing front entrance. Uncle Harold, Carol's brother and a senior partner at one of Edinburgh's most prestigious banking firms, was directing the parking arrangement with the efficiency of a man accustomed to being in charge. His wife, Margaret, adjusted her pearl necklace and smoothed her silk blouse as she surveyed the arriving family members with the practiced eye of someone who noticed everything and filed it all away for later discussion. The youngest of the Reed generation, Cousin David, had just completed his MBA at Oxford and landed a position with a consulting firm that specialized in mergers and acquisitions. Even at 26, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never known real financial uncertainty. His girlfriend, Amanda, worked in marketing for a luxury fashion brand and seemed to view every social gathering as an opportunity to network and establish her social credentials. Ellie took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She'd been dreading this gathering for weeks, knowing exactly what awaited her inside those stone walls. The same well-meaning but devastating conversations about her life choices, her career prospects, her apparent inability to find her place in the world according to Reed family standards. The manor's interior was even more impressive than its exterior, with soaring ceilings, original oak beams, and enough antique furniture to stock a museum. Carol had outdone herself with the decorations, transforming the main hall into an elegant party venue complete with a string quartet, professional catering staff, and enough flowers to supply a royal wedding. The family had already begun to cluster into their familiar groups. The men gravitating toward discussions of interest rates, property investments, and the latest changes in tax legislation. The women comparing vacation destinations, children's schools, and the merits of various country clubs. The younger generation mixed between both groups, comfortable in their roles as successful professionals with bright futures ahead of them. Ellie made her way to the drinks table, opting for a glass of sparkling water while everyone else helped themselves to champagne that probably cost more per bottle than she typically spent on groceries in a week. She found a relatively quiet corner near one of the massive windows overlooking the gardens and tried to blend into the background. Ellie. The voice belonged to her cousin Sarah, 32, and a senior marketing director for a tech company in Glasgow. Sarah approached with what Ellie had come to recognize as the family's characteristic mixture of genuine affection and barely concealed concern. "You look lovely, dear. How have you been?" Before Ellie could answer, Sarah's husband James joined them. James worked in finance, naturally, and had the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to worry about making rent or choosing between buying groceries and paying for heating. "Ellie, good to see you," he said, though his tone suggested he was already preparing for an uncomfortable conversation. "Still doing the writing thing?" Sarah asked, her smile bright but her eyes searching. "Any exciting projects lately?" Ellie had learned over the years that her family's definition of exciting projects differed significantly from her own. To them, exciting meant high-profile, well-paying, and preferably involving a corporate structure with clear advancement opportunities. Her freelance articles about social issues, her blog posts exploring women's experiences, her attempts to build an online platform for authentic storytelling, none of these registered as serious work in their minds. "I'm working on several pieces," Ellie replied carefully. "Some investigative work, some personal essays. I'm also developing a digital platform for independent voices." James and Sarah exchanged the kind of look that married couples perfect over years of shared conversations. It was a look that said, "Here we go again with Ellie's impractical dreams." "That sounds interesting," as Sarah said with the patient tone one might use with a child explaining their imaginary friend. "But are you making any real money from it? I mean, enough to live on properly?" The question hit exactly where it was intended to. Ellie's modest lifestyle was a constant source of family concern and discussion. Her small flat in Manchester, her second-hand furniture, her tendency to wear the same few outfits to every family gathering, all of this was interpreted as evidence that her career choices were leading her toward financial ruin. "I manage fine," Ellie said quietly. "I cover my expenses and I'm happy with my work." "Happy doesn't pay the bills," James said with a laugh that wasn't entirely kind. "Or fund a pension. Or buy a house. Ellie, you're nearly 30. Don't you think it's time to consider something more stable?" The conversation was beginning to attract attention from other family members, as these conversations about Ellie's future always did. Uncle Harold was making his way over, his expression suggesting he'd been waiting for an opportunity to share his thoughts on his niece's career trajectory. "Harold," as Sarah called out, "we were just discussing Ellie's work situation." Uncle Harold approached with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. At 62, he'd built his banking career on his ability to assess risk and provide practical solutions to complex problems. In his mind, Ellie's situation was simply another problem that required his expertise to solve. Ellie," he said, placing a paternal hand on her shoulder. "Just the person I wanted to speak with. I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe I might have a solution." Ellie's heart sank. She knew what was coming. Uncle Harold's solutions always involved abandoning her current path in favor of something he considered more sensible and financially secure. "I've spoken with Margaret," he continued, referring to his wife, "and we both agree that you have potential that's being wasted in this freelance journalism business. Now, I know someone who knows someone at the Royal Bank of Scotland. They're looking for bright young people to join their communications department." "Communications department," Ellie repeated slowly. "Exactly," Harold beamed, pleased that she seemed to be following his logic. It would use your writing skills in a practical, commercial setting. Steady salary, excellent benefits, clear advancement opportunities. You could start as an assistant communications coordinator and work your way up to manager within a few years. The irony wasn't lost on Ellie that her uncle was essentially offering her an entry-level position in corporate communications while dismissing her work as an independent journalist and platform creator as impractical. She could feel other family members gathering around, drawn by the scent of another intervention about Ellie's future. "That's very thoughtful of you, Uncle Harold," Ellie said carefully, "but I'm quite committed to my current work." Margaret had joined the circle, her pearls catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. "Ellie, dear," she said with the practiced patience of a woman who'd raised for successful children, commitment is admirable, but it needs to be realistic. You can't live on idealism forever." Julie chose that moment to join the conversation, her designer heels clicking authoritatively on the polished wooden floor. As the elder sister and a successful solicitor specializing in family law, Julie had always positioned herself as the responsible Reed daughter, the one who'd made the right choices and could offer guidance to her wayward younger sister. "What are we discussing?" Julie asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Ellie's career," Sarah explained. "Harold's found her an opportunity at the Royal Bank." Julie's expression brightened considerably. "Oh, that's wonderful. Ellie, you'd be perfect for corporate communications. You've always been good with words, and it would give you the stability you need." "Stability," Ellie murmured. "Yes," Julie continued, warming to her theme. "A proper salary, a pension scheme, opportunities for advancement. Simon's firm does work with ABS, so you'd even have some connections already in place." Simon, who'd been listening while checking his phone, looked up with the distracted attention of someone juggling multiple important responsibilities. "Good company," he said briefly. "Solid reputation, traditional values. They appreciate people who understand the importance of professional development." David and Amanda had drifted over from their conversation with some of Carol's friends, clearly intrigued by the family conference that was developing around Ellie. David, despite being younger than Ellie, had already established himself as someone whose opinions carried weight in family discussions due to his prestigious MBA and promising career trajectory. "Are we talking about Ellie's job situation again?" David asked with the confident smile of someone who'd never doubted his own path in life. "I keep telling her she should consider consulting. The money's excellent, and she'd get to travel, meet interesting people." "David's right," Amanda chimed in, her voice carrying the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she'd given this considerable thought. With Ellie's education and background, she could easily transition into business communications or marketing. Companies are always looking for people who can write well. The circle of family members continued to grow as more relatives noticed the animated discussion. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Harold's sister-in-law, approached with her husband Robert, both of them successful doctors who built a thriving private practice. Their adult children, both following in their parents' footsteps in medical careers, trailed behind with the confident bearing of people who'd never questioned whether their life choices would lead to financial security. "What's all the excitement about?" Patricia asked, her medical background evident in the way she seemed to be diagnosing the situation before fully understanding it. "We're trying to help Ellie see the benefits of a more traditional career path," Margaret explained. "She's been freelancing for years now, but it's time she considered something more substantial." Robert nodded approvingly. "Freelancing is fine for young people just starting out, but at some point, you need the security that comes with a proper position. Benefits, steady income, retirement planning. The weight of their collective concern was beginning to feel oppressive. Ellie found herself surrounded by successful, well-meaning relatives who were united in their belief that her life was heading in the wrong direction. Their love for her was genuine, but it came wrapped in assumptions about what constituted a worthwhile life. "Ellie's always been creative," a carol said, joining the group that had formed around her birthday celebration's most concerning topic. Even as a child, she was always writing stories, starting little newspapers. "It's lovely, really, but creativity needs to be channeled into something practical." "Exactly," Harold agreed. "Creativity is wonderful, but it's not a career strategy." "Ellie, you're intelligent, educated, articulate. You could excel in any number of traditional fields. This freelance journalism experiment has gone on long enough." The word experiment stung more than Ellie cared to admit. It reduced years of her professional efforts to the status of a phase, a temporary deviation from the serious business of building a real career. She could feel the familiar mixture of shame and frustration rising in her chest, the same feelings that accompanied every family gathering where her life became the subject of collective analysis and improvement efforts. "I know you all mean well," Ellie said, her voice quieter than she'd intended, "but I'm not ready to give up on my current work." "Give up?" Julie's voice rose slightly. "Ellie, this isn't about giving up. This is about growing up. Look around this room. Look at what everyone else has accomplished. Marcus is managing multi-million-pound portfolios. David's already being headhunted by top consulting firms. I'm on track to make partner within 3 years. And what do you have to show for your choices?" Margaret asked, her tone not unkind but devastatingly direct. "A rented flat, a car that's older than some of our grandchildren, and a career that exists primarily on the internet." The assessment was harsh but not inaccurate from their perspective. Ellie's visible lifestyle did little to suggest professional success. She shopped at charity shops, cooked most of her meals at home, and had never owned anything that could be considered a luxury item. To her family, these were warning signs of financial instability rather than conscious choices about how to live and spend. "Ellie," her father's voice cut through the chatter. Richard Reed, the family patriarch at 67, commanded immediate attention when he spoke. As a retired senior partner from one of Scotland's most respected law firms, his opinions carried considerable weight with everyone present. The group parted slightly to allow him through, and Ellie felt her stomach clench with anxiety. Her father's approval had always mattered to her more than she cared to admit, and his disappointment in her career choices was a constant source of private pain. "Dad," she said simply, unable to keep a slight tremor from her voice. Richard Reed studied his younger daughter with the same analytical gaze he'd once turned on complex legal briefs. "I've been listening to this conversation, and I think it's time for some honest talk." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the background chatter from other party guests seemed to fade as family members sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Ellie," her father continued, his voice gentle but firm, "your mother and I raised you to be independent, to think for yourself, to follow your convictions. We're proud of those qualities in you." For a moment, Ellie felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps her father was about to defend her choices, to tell the rest of the family that success couldn't be measured solely in salary figures and job titles. However, Richard continued, and Ellie's heart sank. Independence and conviction need to be balanced with practical considerations. "You're 29 years old, Ellie. You have no savings, no property, no pension contributions. You're living month to month on a regular income from work that may not exist in 5 years. The words landed like physical blows. Each one was accurate from a conventional perspective, and the public nature of this assessment made it even more painful. Ellie could feel the sympathetic looks from her relatives, the mixture of concern and vindication that suggested they'd been thinking the same things but waiting for someone with sufficient authority to voice them. "Your writing is lovely," her mother added, having materialized beside her husband with the unity that characterized their 40-year marriage. "You've always had a gift with words. But gifts need to be used in ways that provide security and stability." Eleanor Reed had spent her career as a successful headmistress at a prestigious private school. She understood the value of education, the importance of nurturing talent, but she also believed deeply in the necessity of practical planning and conventional achievement. In her mind, Ellie's refusal to pursue traditional career advancement was a waste of potential that bordered on self-destructive. "We worry about you," Eleanor continued, her voice soft with genuine maternal concern. "We worry about what happens when you're our age and you haven't built anything substantial. We worry about your future happiness, your security, your ability to have the kind of life you deserve." Marcus, who'd been listening with the attention of someone analyzing a business proposal, stepped forward. "Ellie, if money's the issue, I could help you get started with some investments. Even small amounts, if you begin contributing regularly to a decent portfolio, you could build something significant over time." "It's not about money," Ellie said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "Of course it's about money," James laughed. "Everything's about money eventually. You can pursue your passion projects as hobbies once you've established a stable income base." Penelope nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Look at me, I love photography, but I don't expect it to pay my bills. I have my marketing career for security, and photography for personal fulfillment. It's about balance." The comparison stung because it reduced Ellie's professional work to the level of a hobby, something to be pursued in spare time after the real work of earning a living was completed. The implication was that her dedication to journalism and storytelling was fundamentally unserious, a luxury that she couldn't afford to maintain. "Ellie," David said, his youthful confidence somehow making his words even more cutting, "I don't mean to be harsh, but the freelance journalism market is incredibly competitive. Most people who try to make a living at it end up struggling financially for years before eventually transitioning to something more stable." "David's absolutely right," Amanda agreed. "The media industry is changing so rapidly. Traditional journalism jobs are disappearing, and the competition for freelance work is becoming more intense every year. It's just not a sustainable long-term strategy." Carol, the birthday celebrant herself, had been watching this intervention with the complicated emotions of someone who loved Ellie but also worried about her future. As the family member who'd remained closest to their artistic and creative traditions, Carol understood the appeal of unconventional work, but she also recognized the practical challenges it presented. "Ellie, darling," Carol said, her voice carrying the authority of someone celebrating 6 decades of life experience, "I admire your creativity and your independence. But there's wisdom in listening to people who've built successful careers and financial security." "We're not trying to crush your dreams," Harold added quickly. "We're trying to help you find a way to use your talents in a context that will provide for your future." The intervention was reaching its crescendo, with nearly every adult family member having weighed in with their concerns and suggestions. Ellie found herself at the center of a circle of people who genuinely loved her, but who were united in their belief that her life was heading toward inevitable disappointment and financial hardship. "Look," Julie said, her lawyer's instincts taking over as she attempted to summarize the family's position, "We all recognize that you're talented. You write beautifully, you're intelligent, you're dedicated. But talent without a strategic career plan is just an expensive hobby. Julie's right. As Simon agreed. I see this all the time in my practice. Creative people who spend their 20s and 30s pursuing artistic careers and then find themselves in their 40s with no retirement savings, no property equity, no financial foundation for the second half of their lives. The assessment was delivered with the clinical precision of a legal brief, but its emotional impact was devastating. Ellie could feel tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, not from anger but from the crushing weight of their collective disappointment in her life choices. We just want what's best for you, her mother said softly. We want you to have the kind of security and success that will allow you to be happy in the long term. Patricia stepped forward with the professional compassion she developed during decades of medical practice. Ellie, dear, sometimes the people who love us can see things more clearly than we can ourselves. We're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help you see that there are alternatives to struggling as a freelancer. I'm not struggling, Ellie protested, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Aren't you? Margaret asked gently. Ellie, you're driving a car that's older than some of our grandchildren. You're wearing the same dress you wore to Robert's birthday party 2 years ago. You live in a flat that's smaller than most people's sitting rooms. The observations were accurate and devastating precisely because they were delivered with love rather than malice. These people weren't trying to be cruel. They were genuinely concerned about what they perceived as her inability to achieve conventional markers of adult success. Your cousin Emma just bought her first house, Harold pointed out. She's 27, 2 years younger than you, and she's already building equity and planning for her financial future. Emma, who worked in pharmaceutical sales, had indeed recently purchased a terraced house in a respectable suburb of Glasgow. The achievement had been celebrated extensively at the last family gathering, held up as an example of what could be accomplished with dedication and practical career planning. We're not comparing you to Emma to make you feel bad, Eleanor clarified quickly. We're pointing out that with your education and abilities, you could achieve the same kind of stability and success if you made different choices. The weight of their expectations was becoming unbearable. Ellie could feel the familiar sensation of shrinking, of becoming smaller and quieter in the face of their collective certainty about what her life should look like. These people who'd known her since childhood, who'd celebrated her academic achievements and encouraged her early writing efforts, now viewed those same qualities as obstacles to her proper integration into adult society. I understand your concerns, Ellie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I know my choices don't make sense to you. They don't have to make sense to us, her father said. They need to make sense for your future. Ellie, we've watched you struggle with this freelance work for years now. We've seen you stress about money, turn down social invitations because you couldn't afford them, postpone plans because of financial uncertainty. The accuracy of his observations was painful to acknowledge. There had indeed been months when freelance work was scarce, when she'd lived on beans and toast and worried about making rent. There had been social events she'd skipped because she couldn't afford the dinner or the outfit or the transportation. There had been moments of doubt when she'd wondered if her family was right about the impracticality of her chosen path. But I'm building something, she said, though her voice lacked the conviction she'd hoped for. My platform, my writing, my audience. It takes time to establish yourself in independent media. How much time? David asked with the directness of someone who'd been trained to cut through vague business proposals to identify concrete metrics. You've been at this for what, 5 years now? 6? At what point do you acknowledge that it's not working? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ellie realized that from their perspective, her career did look like a series of false starts and unfulfilled promises. They didn't see the small victories, the gradual building of skills and connections, the slow development of her voice and platform. They saw only the external markers of financial struggle and the absence of conventional professional advancement. Sometimes the most worthwhile things take longer to build than we expect, as she said, though she could hear the defensiveness in her own voice. And sometimes, Marcus said with the gentle brutality of someone accustomed to delivering difficult financial news to clients, we need to recognize when our expectations aren't aligned with reality. The statement felt like a verdict. Marcus's success in investment management had been built on his ability to assess when strategies were working and when they needed to be abandoned. In his professional opinion, Ellie's career strategy was failing and needed to be restructured. "Marcus is right," a herald said. "Ellie, I'm going to be direct because someone needs to be. You're nearly 30 years old. You have no assets, no savings, no clear path toward financial independence. If you continue on this trajectory, you'll reach 40 with nothing to show for your efforts but a collection of unpublished articles and a failed blog." The assessment was brutal in its accuracy from a conventional perspective. Uncle Harold wasn't being cruel. He was applying the same analytical framework he used in banking to evaluate the viability of Ellie's life choices. From his professional standpoint, her career trajectory showed all the warning signs of a failing investment. "We love you," Margaret added quickly, as if to soften the impact of Harold's words. "That's why we're having this conversation. We want to see you succeed and be happy." "But what if my definition of success is different from yours?" Ellie asked, though her voice was so quiet that several family members had to lean forward to hear her. "Success isn't subjective when it comes to basic financial security," as Simon said with the authority of someone who'd spent his career dealing with the practical consequences of poor financial planning. "You can define happiness however you want, but you can't redefine the need for income, savings, and retirement planning." The logic was unassailable from their perspective, and Ellie found herself unable to articulate a coherent response. How could she explain that her work felt meaningful and important when the external evidence suggested only struggle and uncertainty? How could she defend choices that even she sometimes questioned during the long, difficult months when work was scarce and bills were mounting? "Ellie," her father said, his voice taking on the tone he'd once used when delivering closing arguments to juries, "we're not asking you to abandon writing entirely. We're asking you to be realistic about how writing fits into a sustainable life plan." "Write in your spare time," Julie suggested. "Keep a blog, contribute to magazines as a side project. But build your financial foundation on something more reliable." The suggestion felt like a death sentence for everything she'd worked toward. The idea of relegating her journalism and platform development to hobby status, of accepting that her professional identity should be built around work that felt meaningless to her, was almost unbearable to contemplate. "I need some air," Ellie said suddenly, the weight of their collective expectations becoming too much to bear. But as she turned toward the French doors leading to the terrace, her path was blocked by yet another family member eager to contribute to the discussion of her future. This time it was her cousin Rebecca, 34, and a successful architect who'd recently completed work on a high-profile cultural centre in Edinburgh. "Ellie," Rebecca said with the confident smile of someone who'd never doubted her professional trajectory, I couldn't help overhearing. "You know, architecture firms are always looking for people who can write compelling project proposals and grant applications. It's creative work, but with a clear commercial application." The suggestion was delivered with such helpful enthusiasm that Ellie almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Here was another family member, another successful professional, another person who believed they'd identified the perfect solution to her impractical career choices. "Thank you," Ellie managed to say. "I'll certainly consider it." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel something shifting inside her. The constant pressure to justify her choices, to defend her vision of what her life could become, to explain why conventional success didn't appeal to her, was becoming exhausting in a way that felt unsustainable. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps it was time to accept that her dreams of building something meaningful through independent journalism and storytelling was simply that, dreams. Perhaps the smart thing, the mature thing, would be to accept Uncle Harold's offer or one of the many other practical suggestions that had been offered with such loving concern. As the conversation continued around her, with family members discussing the various career opportunities available to someone with her education and abilities, Ellie felt herself becoming smaller and quieter. The confident young woman who'd started the evening determined to hold her ground was being worn down by the relentless logic of people who'd built successful lives through conventional means. "We should let Ellie think about all these wonderful opportunities," Carol said finally, sensing that her niece was becoming overwhelmed by the intensity of the family's intervention. "Of course," Harold agreed. "But Ellie, promise me you'll seriously consider the banking position. I could arrange an interview within the week." "And think about the consulting angle," David added. "I have contacts who could get your CV in front of the right people." "The architecture proposal writing could be perfect for you," Rebecca insisted. "It's creative but practical." As the family members began to disperse, returning to their champagne and their conversations about successful careers and financial planning, Ellie found herself standing alone near the window, watching the sun set over the Scottish countryside. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable, but she felt disconnected from it, isolated by the growing certainty that she was failing to live up to the expectations of people whose opinions mattered to her. The evening continued around her, but Ellie felt increasingly like an observer rather than a participant. She watched her relatives discuss their children's achievements, their recent promotions, their investment strategies, their vacation plans. She listened to conversations about school fees and property values and pension contributions, all the markers of successful adult life that she'd failed to accumulate. When the party finally began to wind down, Ellie found herself helping with the cleanup, grateful for tasks that didn't require conversation. She carried plates and glasses, folded chairs, and attempted to make herself useful in ways that wouldn't draw attention to her presence. "Ellie," her mother approached as she was stacking dessert plates. "Are you all right? You've been very quiet this evening." "I'm fine, Mum," Ellie replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. "We're not trying to hurt you," Eleanor said softly. "We just worry about your future." "I know," Ellie said, and she did know. The family's intervention came from love, even if the execution felt like a coordinated attack on everything she'd worked toward. "Promise me you'll think about what everyone said tonight," her mother continued. "There are so many opportunities available to you if you're willing to consider them." Ellie nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The promise felt like a betrayal of everything she'd worked toward, but the alternative, continuing to defend choices that even she sometimes questioned, seemed equally impossible. As the last guests departed and the family members said their goodbyes, Ellie found herself walking toward her ancient Ford Focus with slower steps than usual. The car, which had seemed merely old when she'd arrived, now felt like a symbol of everything that was wrong with her life choices. Uncle Harold intercepted her before she reached the car. "Ellie," he said, his voice warm with affection despite the evening's difficult conversations, "I hope you know that everything we said tonight came from love." "I know, Uncle Harold." "Good," he smiled. And I meant what I said about the banking position. One phone call, and you could have an interview by the end of the week. Real salary, real benefits, real opportunity for advancement. Ellie nodded, unable to form words around the tightness in her throat. Think about it, a herald said, patting her shoulder with paternal affection. Think about what kind of life you want to have at 40, at 50, at 60. Think about whether your current path can get you there. As Ellie drove away from Thornfield Manor, the ancient stone walls disappearing in her rearview mirror, she carried with her the weight of her family's expectations and the growing certainty that perhaps they were right. Perhaps it was time to stop chasing dreams that seemed to recede further into the distance with each passing year. The train to Manchester departed at 9:30 that evening, and Ellie found herself with an hour to kill at Edinburgh Waverley Station. She bought a cup of tea and found a bench on the platform, surrounded by other travellers heading south toward England and their various destinations. As she sat in the dim station lighting, Ellie pulled out her phone and scrolled through her recent work, the articles and blog posts that had consumed her time and energy over the past months. Viewed through the lens of her family's intervention, her professional output looked thin and insubstantial. A few published pieces, a modest blog following, some small payments that barely covered her basic expenses. The 21:30 to Manchester was announced over the station's public address system, and Ellie gathered her things with the slow movements of someone whose energy had been thoroughly depleted. As she walked toward the platform, she found herself wondering if this would be the last time she made this journey as a freelance journalist, if the next time she visited her family she'd be able to report stable employment and conventional success. The train car was nearly empty, just a few other passengers scattered throughout the carriage, each absorbed in their own thoughts and destinations. Ellie found a window seat and settled in for the journey south, watching the Scottish countryside disappear into darkness as the train gathered speed toward Manchester and whatever decision awaited her there. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels on the tracks created a hypnotic soundtrack for what would become the most important 3 hours of Ellie Reid's life. As the lights of small Scottish towns flickered past her window, she pulled out a worn notebook, the same one she'd been carrying for years, filled with half-finished story ideas, interview notes, and fragments of thoughts that had never quite developed into anything substantial. She flipped through pages of her own handwriting, years of effort and aspiration reduced to scattered notes and abandoned projects. Here was the outline for an investigative piece about housing inequality that she'd never finished because she couldn't afford the time to do proper research. There was the beginning of a personal essay about growing up in a family of high achievers that she'd started and stopped dozens of times, never quite finding the courage to be as vulnerable as the piece required. Page after page of unfinished work, of stories that had died in their infancy because she'd been too busy scrambling for the next small freelance assignment to give them the attention they deserved. As she read through her own notes, Ellie began to see a pattern that she'd been too close to recognize before. She wasn't failing because she lacked talent or dedication. She was failing because she'd been approaching her career like someone who didn't believe in herself. Someone who was apologizing for her choices rather than committing to them fully. She'd been writing what she thought editors wanted rather than what she needed to say. She'd been accepting small assignments that paid immediately rather than investing time in building something larger and more meaningful. The train passed through a tunnel, plunging the car into temporary darkness, and in that moment of reflection, Ellie made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to accept Uncle Harold's banking job. She wasn't going to transition into corporate communications or consulting or any of the other practical careers her family had suggested. But she also wasn't going to continue approaching her current work with the half-hearted commitment that had characterized her efforts so far. If she was going to fail, she was going to fail while giving everything she had to something she believed in. And if she was going to succeed, it was going to be on her own terms, building something that mattered to her rather than something that would simply satisfy her family's expectations. She opened her laptop, balanced it carefully on the small train table, and began to write. Not another half-hearted pitch to a magazine editor, not another desperate attempt to secure a small freelance assignment, but a manifesto for herself about what she was going to build and why it mattered. "I am Ellie Reed," as she wrote, "and I am going to become the journalist and storyteller I know I can be. Not because my family believes in this path, but because I do. Not because it's practical or safe, but because it's necessary." The words flowed with a clarity and conviction that had been missing from her work for years. She wrote about the stories that needed to be told, the voices that needed to be amplified, the platform she wanted to create for women whose experiences had been marginalized or ignored by mainstream media. By the time the train pulled into Manchester Piccadilly station at midnight, Ellie had filled 12 pages with plans, ideas, and commitments. She had a vision now, not just for surviving as a freelance journalist, but for building something significant and lasting. The first thing she did when she reached her small flat was to ignore the pile of bills on her kitchen table and instead boot up her ancient desktop computer. If she was going to commit to this path, she needed to approach it with the same level of professionalism and strategic thinking that her successful relatives brought to their careers. She spent the rest of the night researching online courses in digital journalism, content marketing, audience development, and platform building. By dawn, she had enrolled in 4 different programs and created a study schedule that would require her to wake up at 5 o'clock every morning for the next 6 months. The alarm went off at 5 a.m. sharp, and for the first time in years, Ellie bounded out of bed with genuine enthusiasm. She made coffee, opened her laptop, and began the first lesson of a comprehensive course in investigative journalism techniques. The instructor, a former BBC correspondent, explained how to research stories that mattered, how to find sources, how to verify information, and how to present findings in ways that would compel readers to care. It was everything Ellie had been missing in her haphazard approach to freelance work. Structure, methodology, professional standards that went beyond simply being able to write well. She took notes with the intensity of a medical student, filling page after page with techniques and strategies that she could immediately see applying to her own work. The second course focused on digital marketing for creative professionals. Ellie learned about search engine optimization, social media strategy, email marketing, and audience development. Concepts that had seemed mysterious and intimidating when she'd encountered them in passing became clear and actionable when explained by experts who understood the creative industry. The third course covered storytelling for social impact, taught by a journalist who'd won awards for her coverage of women's rights issues. This was the content that made Ellie's heart race with excitement. Here was someone who'd built a successful career around exactly the kind of work Ellie wanted to do. Telling stories that mattered, amplifying voices that needed to be heard, creating change through journalism. The fourth course was the most challenging, focusing on building sustainable income streams as an independent media creator. The instructor, a former magazine editor who transitioned to running her own digital platform, broke down the economics of independent journalism in ways that were both sobering and inspiring. Most freelance journalists fail, the instructor explained in the first lesson, and not because they can't write, but because they approach their career like it's a hobby rather than a business. If you want to succeed as an independent journalist, you need to think like an entrepreneur, not like an employee waiting for someone else to give you work. The insight hit Ellie like a revelation. She'd been approaching her career exactly like a hobby, waiting for editors to assign her work, hoping for opportunities rather than creating them, treating her professional development as something that would happen to her rather than something she needed to actively manage. Over the following weeks, Ellie's life transformed completely. Every morning at 5, she was at her laptop, working through course materials, taking notes, completing assignments. By 7, she was analyzing successful independent media platforms, studying how other journalists had built audiences and sustainable income streams. From 8 to 10, she worked on developing her own content strategy. Rather than writing random pieces and hoping someone would want to publish them, she began to identify specific topics she wanted to explore, specific audiences she wanted to reach, specific outcomes she wanted to achieve through her work. The process was harder than anything she'd attempted in her previous approach to freelance journalism. The courses demanded not just that she learn new skills, but that she fundamentally rethink her relationship to her work and her career. She had to stop seeing herself as someone who wrote occasionally when inspiration struck and start seeing herself as a professional who showed up every day regardless of how she felt. The financial reality was challenging. Ellie had to reduce her expenses even further, living on a diet of pasta and vegetables, walking instead of taking buses, cancelling every subscription and service that wasn't absolutely essential. Her already modest lifestyle became even more austere as she invested every spare pound in her education and professional development. But something had changed in her relationship to these sacrifices. Previously, living cheaply had felt like evidence of her failure to achieve conventional success. Now it felt like a strategic choice, a temporary investment in building something larger and more sustainable. The courses also connected her with other independent journalists and content creators who were facing similar challenges. For the first time in her career, Ellie found herself part of a community of people who understood the difficulties and rewards of building something from nothing. She joined online forums where journalists shared strategies, supported each other through difficult periods, and celebrated small victories that wouldn't have registered as significant to people outside the industry. When someone landed their first paying client or reached 100 email subscribers or published a piece they were particularly proud of, the community responded with genuine enthusiasm and encouragement. 3 months into her intensive education program, Ellie began to see her work differently. Instead of writing isolated pieces about topics that interested her, she started to develop a coherent editorial vision. She wanted to create a platform for women who felt marginalized by traditional media, women whose stories weren't being told or whose perspectives weren't being represented in mainstream publications. She called the project Aurora Voices, a name that captured both the authentic, unfiltered nature of the content she wanted to create and the emotional rawness of experiences that often went unexplored in polished magazine articles. The platform would feature long-form interviews with women from diverse backgrounds, personal essays that explored the complexity of modern female experience, and investigative pieces that examined issues affecting women's lives. Rather than trying to appeal to the broadest possible audience, Ellie decided to focus intensely on serving a specific community of readers who were hungry for more honest, nuanced content than they could find elsewhere. The decision to narrow her focus rather than trying to write for everyone was terrifying. It meant deliberately limiting her potential audience and accepting that her work wouldn't appeal to certain demographics. But the courses had taught her that successful independent media creators built audiences by serving specific communities exceptionally well rather than trying to be everything to everyone. Ellie spent weeks developing the editorial guidelines for Raw Voices, defining not just what kinds of stories she wanted to tell, but how she wanted to tell them. She wanted writing that was accessible without being simplistic, emotional without being manipulative, personal without being narcissistic. She also began to develop her own voice as a writer in ways she'd never attempted before. Previously, she tried to write in the style that she thought editors and publications wanted, adapting her voice to fit different outlets rather than developing a consistent perspective that readers could recognize and connect with. Now she began to write with the honesty and vulnerability that had been missing from her previous work. She wrote about her own experiences growing up in a family of high achievers, about the pressure to conform to conventional definitions of success, about the isolation of pursuing work that others didn't understand or value. The first piece she completed for Roar Voices was a personal essay about the experience of being the family disappointment, the one whose choices are constantly questioned and whose achievements are never quite enough to earn respect or approval. She wrote about the emotional cost of constantly defending your vision to people who love you but don't believe in your choices. Writing the piece was emotionally exhausting. Ellie found herself crying at her laptop as she worked through memories and feelings she'd been avoiding for years. But when she finished, she had created something that felt true and important in a way that none of her previous work had achieved. The technical aspects of launching Roar Voices proved to be just as challenging as the creative elements. Ellie had to learn about website design, email marketing systems, social media strategy, and analytics tracking. Every day brought new technical problems that required hours of research and troubleshooting. She taught herself basic HTML and CSS so she could customize her website beyond the limitations of standard templates. She learned about search engine optimization so her content could be discovered by people searching for the topics she covered. She studied successful newsletters and podcasts to understand how other creators had built engaged audiences around specific topics. The learning curve was steep and often frustrating. There were days when Ellie spent more time wrestling with technical problems than actually writing. There were moments when she questioned whether she had the skills necessary to build what she envisioned. But gradually, piece by piece, the platform began to take shape. She published her first essay, the personal piece about family expectations, on a simple website that she'd built herself. She sent it to the 12 people who'd signed up for her email list, mostly friends, and a few contacts from her previous freelance work. The response was immediate and powerful. 3 people forwarded the piece to friends. 2 shared it on social media with comments about how it had resonated with their own experiences. 1 reader sent a long email describing how the essay had helped her feel less alone in her own struggles with family pressure to pursue conventional success. Ellie realized she discovered something that had been missing from her previous work, the ability to create content that didn't just inform or entertain, but that made readers feel seen and understood. This was the beginning of building what marketing experts called an engaged community rather than just an audience. Encouraged by the response to her first piece, Ellie began publishing weekly essays that explored different aspects of women's experiences with career pressure, family expectations, and societal definitions of success. Each piece was deeply researched but also personally honest, combining journalistic rigor with the kind of vulnerability that encouraged readers to examine their own experiences. Her email list began to grow slowly but steadily. 20 subscribers became 40. 40 became 75. Each new subscriber felt like a validation of her vision and her decision to commit fully to this path. She also began to pitch her work more strategically to established publications. Instead of sending generic query letters to random editors, she researched specific magazines and websites that published content aligned with her editorial vision. She studied their recent articles, understood their audience, and crafted pitches that demonstrated how her work would serve their readers. The process required a level of professionalism and strategic thinking that had been missing from her previous approach to freelance work. She had to learn to see editors not as gatekeepers who might reject her work, but as potential collaborators who were looking for content that would serve their publication's goals. 6 months after the devastating family intervention at Thornfield Manor, Ellie was working harder than she'd ever worked in her life. She was also happier and more confident than she'd been since leaving university. Not because her external circumstances had improved dramatically, but because she was finally approaching her work with the kind of full commitment that made success possible. She'd stopped apologizing for her career choices and started building something that justified them. She'd stopped waiting for permission to pursue meaningful work and started creating opportunities for herself and others. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in April. Ellie had pitched a piece about women's experiences with career transitions to a mid-sized online publication that specialized in workplace issues. The editor, Sarah Chen, not only accepted the pitch but asked if Ellie could deliver the piece within a week for a special issue about changing definitions of professional success. The assignment paid £300, the largest single payment Ellie had ever received for her writing. But more importantly, it was going to be published by a platform that reached over 50,000 readers, giving her work the kind of visibility she'd been striving toward for years. As Ellie opened her laptop to begin working on the piece that would mark her transition from struggling freelancer to emerging independent journalist, she thought about the train journey that had started this transformation. The family intervention that had felt like the end of her career had actually been the beginning of her real professional development. She wasn't ready to call her family and announce her success, not yet. But for the first time since leaving university, Ellie Reid felt like she was building something that could become everything she'd dreamed it might be. The article for Sarah Chen's publication became Ellie's breakthrough piece. Titled The Unspoken Cost of Career Courage, it explored the emotional and social toll of pursuing unconventional professional paths, particularly for women from traditional, success-oriented families. The piece combined rigorous research with personal narrative, statistical analysis with emotional honesty. Sarah not only published the article but featured it prominently on the publication's homepage and promoted it across their social media channels. Within 48 hours, the piece had generated over 15,000 page views and been shared across multiple platforms by readers who connected deeply with its message. More importantly, the article brought Ellie to the attention of other editors and platform creators who were looking for writers capable of combining journalistic rigor with personal insight. Within 2 weeks of publication, she received 3 additional assignment offers, each paying more than she'd typically earned in a month of scrambling for small freelance projects. But the real transformation came in how Ellie approached these new opportunities. Instead of accepting every assignment that was offered, she evaluated each one against her developing editorial vision for Roar Voices. Would this piece serve the community she was trying to build? Would it contribute to the larger conversation she wanted to facilitate about women's experiences with career pressure and societal expectations? The selectivity felt risky initially. Turning down paid work when she still struggled financially went against every survival instinct she developed during her years of freelance uncertainty. But the courses had taught her that building a sustainable independent media career required consistency of vision and voice, even when that meant saying no to opportunities that didn't align with her long-term goals. Roar Voices began to evolve from a personal blog into something approaching a legitimate media platform. Ellie published a new essay every Wednesday, each one exploring a different aspect of women's professional and personal experiences. She interviewed women who'd made unconventional career choices, who'd started businesses, who'd left traditional jobs to pursue creative work, who'd navigated family pressure while building lives that reflected their values rather than external expectations. The interview series proved to be particularly popular with her growing audience. Women wrote to her about feeling seen and represented in ways they hadn't experienced in mainstream media. They shared stories about their own struggles with family expectations, their own efforts to build meaningful careers outside traditional structures, their own experiences of being misunderstood or underestimated by people who measured success in conventional terms. 6 months after launching Roar Voices in earnest, Ellie's email list had grown to nearly 300 subscribers. The numbers might have seemed modest compared to major publications, but these were engaged readers who opened every email, shared content regularly, and participated actively in the community discussions that Ellie had begun to facilitate around each piece. She also began to experiment with different content formats. In addition to her weekly essays, she started recording podcast conversations with the women she interviewed, creating audio content that allowed for even more intimate and nuanced discussions than written pieces alone could provide. The podcast, also called Raw Voices, launched with a two-part interview with a former investment banker who'd left her six-figure salary to start a non-profit organization focused on financial literacy for women. The conversation explored not just the career transition itself, but the emotional journey of disappointing family expectations while pursuing work that felt meaningful. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, the podcast had been downloaded over 2,000 times. Listeners sent emails describing how the conversation had inspired them to reconsider their own career choices or had helped them feel less alone in their struggles with professional dissatisfaction. Ellie realized she'd stumbled onto something that the media landscape was missing: long-form, honest conversations about the real challenges of building authentic professional lives in a world that often prioritized conventional success over personal fulfillment. As Raw Voices grew, so did the opportunities surrounding it. Ellie began receiving speaking invitations from women's organizations, professional development conferences, and university career centers. Initially, these were small, local events that paid modest honoraria, but they provided valuable experience in presenting her ideas to live audiences and receiving immediate feedback about what resonated most powerfully. Her first major speaking engagement came 8 months after launching the platform. The Women in Business Forum in Manchester invited her to speak about building authentic career narratives in a success-obsessed culture. The audience of 200 professional women included entrepreneurs, corporate executives, creative professionals, and career changers. Ellie's presentation drew heavily on the stories she'd collected through Raw Voices, but she also shared her own journey from family disappointment to independent media creator. The response was electric. During the question and answer session, woman after woman stood up to share similar experiences with family pressure, professional uncertainty, and the challenge of defining success on their own terms. After the event, Ellie was approached by several audience members who wanted to collaborate on various projects. One was a documentary filmmaker interested in creating a visual series based on the Raw Voices interviews. Another was a business coach who specialized in helping women navigate career transitions and wanted to develop content partnerships. Most significantly, she met Helena Rodriguez, a successful entrepreneur who'd built and sold 2 tech companies before starting a venture capital fund focused on supporting women-led businesses. Helena had been following Raw Voices since its early days and was interested in discussing potential funding opportunities for expanding the platform. "What you're building matters," a Helena told Ellie over coffee after the presentation. "There's a huge underserved market of women who are hungry for the kind of authentic career content you're creating. But to reach them effectively, you need to think bigger about your platform and your business model." The conversation with Helena opened Ellie's eyes to possibilities she hadn't previously considered. Instead of thinking about Raw Voices as a personal blog that might eventually generate enough income to support her modest lifestyle, she began to envision it as a legitimate media company that could employ other writers, produce multiple content streams, and serve as a hub for the community that was already forming around her work. Helena introduced Ellie to other entrepreneurs and investors who were interested in supporting mission-driven media ventures. These conversations taught Ellie about revenue models she hadn't known existed, from subscription services to corporate partnerships to online course development. 1 year after the launch of Raw Voices, Ellie made the decision to incorporate as a limited company and begin treating her platform as a proper business rather than an extended freelance project. The transition required learning about business registration, tax obligations, contract negotiation, and financial management, skills that hadn't been covered in her journalism courses but were essential for sustainable growth. She also made her first hire, bringing on Maria Santos, a recent journalism graduate who'd been following Roar Voices since its early days and had submitted several excellent story pitches that Ellie couldn't pursue due to time constraints. Maria's background in digital marketing complemented Ellie's editorial skills, and together they began to systematize the content creation and audience development processes that Ellie had been managing single-handedly. The addition of Maria allowed Roar Voices to increase its publishing frequency and expand into new content areas. They launched a monthly newsletter that combined original reporting with curated content from other sources, a weekly podcast series featuring shorter conversations with interesting women, and a quarterly digital magazine that presented their best long-form work in a more polished format. Each expansion brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. The quarterly magazine attracted advertising interest from companies that wanted to reach Roar Voices' educated, professional female audience. The sponsorship revenue, while modest initially, provided the financial stability that allowed Ellie to focus on content creation rather than constantly worrying about covering basic expenses. 18 months after launching, Roar Voices had grown to over 5,000 email subscribers. The podcast was averaging 15,000 downloads per episode, and the platform was generating enough revenue to support both Ellie and Maria while reinvesting in further growth. The success metrics were meaningful. But what mattered more to Ellie was the feedback from her audience. Women wrote to describe how Roar Voices content had influenced their career decisions, helped them navigate difficult family conversations, or simply made them feel less alone in their professional struggles. Teachers shared Roar Voices articles with students who were questioning traditional career paths. Mothers forwarded episodes to daughters who were facing pressure to choose more conventional professions. Career counselors recommended the platform to clients who were struggling to balance personal fulfillment with practical considerations. Ellie realized she'd created something that went beyond journalism or entertainment. Roar Voices had become a resource for women who were trying to build authentic professional lives in a culture that often pressured them toward conformity and conventional achievement. The platform's growing influence brought opportunities that Ellie could never have imagined during her years of struggling as a freelance journalist. The BBC invited her to contribute to a radio series about changing workplace cultures. A major publishing house approached her about writing a book based on the Roar Voices content and philosophy. Most significantly, she was invited to speak at the Forbes Women's Forum in London, a prestigious event that brought together female leaders from across industries to discuss trends affecting women's professional development. The invitation came with a speaking fee that exceeded what Ellie had earned in her best month of previous freelance work. Preparing for the Forbes event required Ellie to articulate her vision for Roar Voices in ways that would resonate with an audience of highly successful women who might not naturally relate to stories about rejecting conventional career paths. She had to find ways to present her work that acknowledged the value of traditional success, while also making the case for alternative approaches to professional fulfillment. Her presentation, titled The Courage of Authentic Choice, explored how women's career decisions were shaped by family expectations, societal pressure, and their own internalized beliefs about what constituted worthwhile work. She argued that supporting diverse definitions of professional success wasn't just personally important for individual women, but economically beneficial for society as a whole. The response from the Forbes audience was overwhelmingly positive. During the networking sessions that followed her presentation, Ellie was approached by executives from major corporations who were interested in featuring Roar Voices content in their internal communications, by investors who wanted to discuss funding opportunities, and by other media creators who wanted to explore collaboration possibilities. 2 years after that devastating family intervention at Thornfield Manor, Roar Voices had become exactly what Ellie had envisioned: a thriving platform that served an underrepresented audience while generating sustainable revenue and creating opportunities for other content creators. The platform now employed 4 people full-time and worked with a network of freelance contributors who shared Ellie's commitment to authentic storytelling about women's experiences. The podcast had been downloaded over 200,000 times. The email list had grown to 12,000 subscribers, and corporate partnerships were generating enough revenue to fund ambitious editorial projects. But perhaps most importantly, Ellie had proven to herself that her instincts about what was missing from the media landscape had been correct. There was indeed an audience for the kind of honest, nuanced content about women's professional lives that Roar Voices provided, and that audience was willing to support the platform financially. As she prepared for her sister Julie's wedding, scheduled for the following weekend, Ellie reflected on how dramatically her circumstances had changed since the last major family gathering. She was no longer the struggling freelancer whose career choices were a source of family concern. She was the founder and CEO of a successful media company, a sought-after speaker and commentator, and a recognized voice in conversations about women's professional development. But more than the external markers of success, Ellie had gained something even more valuable: the confidence that came from proving to herself that her vision had been worth pursuing, even when everyone she loved had questioned its viability. The wedding invitation sat on her desk beside a folder of speaking requests, partnership proposals, and interview opportunities that had accumulated over the past month. As she looked at Julie's elegant calligraphy announcing the celebration of her marriage to Simon, Ellie wondered how her family would react to the transformation she'd undergone since their last gathering. Tomorrow, she would drive back to Scotland for Julie's wedding, back to face the relatives who'd staged their well-meaning intervention 2 years earlier. But this time, she would arrive as someone who'd built exactly the kind of meaningful, successful career they'd thought was impossible. Julie's wedding was everything the Reed family did well: elegant, expensive, and perfectly orchestrated. The ceremony took place at Glenfinnan House, a luxury hotel overlooking one of Scotland's most photographed lochs, with the kind of breathtaking Highland scenery that made even the most jaded guests pause to appreciate the natural beauty surrounding them. Ellie arrived in the same navy dress she'd worn to Aunt Carol's birthday party 2 years earlier, though she'd paired it with a new blazer and shoes that reflected her improved financial situation. She wasn't interested in displaying wealth, but she also wasn't going to apologize for her choices by appearing deliberately downtrodden. The difference in her demeanor was immediately apparent to anyone who'd known her before. She walked with the confidence of someone who'd proven something important to herself, who tested her convictions against reality and found them sound. The uncertainty and defensiveness that had characterized her interactions with family members had been replaced by a quiet self-assurance that was far more powerful than any external display of success could have been. "Ellie!" Her cousin Marcus spotted her first, approaching with the broad smile of someone genuinely happy to see a family member. "You look wonderful. How have you been?" "Very well, thank you," Ellie replied, and meant it. "Congratulations on the promotion, by the way. I saw the announcement in the Financial Times." Marcus looked pleased and slightly surprised that she'd been following his career developments. In previous family gatherings, Ellie had often seemed disconnected from her relatives' professional achievements, not out of malice but because she'd felt so distant from their world of corporate success. "Thank you," Marcus said. "And what about you? Still working on the journalism projects?" Before Ellie could answer, David and Amanda joined them, both looking prosperous and successful in the way that successful young professionals always managed at formal events. David's consulting career had continued to flourish, and Amanda had recently been promoted to senior marketing manager at her fashion company. "Ellie," David said warmly, "great to see you. Amanda was just saying she'd been thinking about you recently. Weren't you, Amanda?" Amanda nodded enthusiastically. "I was reading this amazing article about women who've built unconventional careers, and it reminded me of our conversations about your writing work. The piece was in some online publication I'd never heard of before, but it was so insightful about the pressure women face to choose traditional career paths. Ellie felt a flutter of amusement. What was the publication called? Let me think, Amanda said, pulling out her phone to check her saved articles. It was called Roar Voices, I think. The author had this incredible way of combining personal experience with broader social analysis. That sounds interesting, Ellie said carefully. Oh, it was fascinating, Amanda continued, warming to her subject. The writer explored how families often pressure women toward conventional success even when they're clearly talented in other areas. It made me think about how we've all been so focused on traditional markers of achievement. David nodded thoughtfully. I remember reading something similar recently. There's definitely been a shift in how people think about career satisfaction versus just financial success. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Uncle Harold and Margaret, both dressed immaculately and clearly enjoying the wedding festivities. Harold looked every inch the successful banker, while Margaret radiated the satisfaction of someone whose children had all achieved exactly the kind of conventional success she'd hoped for. Ellie, dear, Margaret said, embracing her niece warmly. How lovely you look. We were just talking about you the other day, wondering how you've been managing. Managing quite well, thank you, Ellie replied. Harold studied her with the analytical gaze he'd perfected during decades of assessing financial risks and opportunities. You seem different, he said thoughtfully. More, settled somehow. I hope that means you've given some consideration to our previous conversations about career planning. Before Ellie could respond, Sarah and James appeared, both looking slightly flustered from chasing their young children around the hotel's elegant grounds. Sarah's legal career had continued to advance steadily, and James had recently been promoted to senior partner at his firm. Ellie, as Sarah said breathlessly, is sorry we're late. The children were fascinated by the loch, and we had to practically drag them away from the water. How have you been? Wonderfully, Ellie said, and the simple certainty in her voice seemed to surprise everyone. That's great to hear, James said, though his tone suggested he was waiting for clarification about what wonderfully might mean in the context of Ellie's unconventional career situation. Julie chose that moment to approach their growing group, radiant in her wedding dress and clearly enjoying her role as the bride at the center of attention. As the elder sister, Julie had always felt a particular responsibility for Ellie's welfare, and her success in building a traditional legal career had given weight to her opinions about professional development. My beautiful family, Julie said, embracing Ellie warmly. I'm so glad you're all here. Ellie, you look absolutely lovely. And I have to say, you seem so much more confident than the last time we were all together. Thank you, Ellie said. And congratulations. You look stunning, and Simon seems absolutely devoted. He is wonderful, Julie agreed, glowing with happiness. And speaking of wonderful things, we were all discussing your situation earlier, and we're so pleased that you seem to have found some stability. The assumption in Julie's statement was clear. Ellie's improved demeanor must indicate that she'd finally accepted one of the practical career suggestions that had been offered at previous family gatherings. The possibility that she'd achieved stability through the very career path they'd all discouraged didn't seem to have occurred to anyone. Stability is important, Ellie agreed diplomatically. Exactly, Harold said, beaming with the satisfaction of someone whose advice had apparently been taken. I knew you'd come around eventually. The banking position is still available, by the way, if you're interested in discussing the details. That's very kind of you to keep the opportunity open, Ellie said, but I'm quite committed to my current work. The statement created a moment of confused silence. Marcus looked puzzled, David raised an eyebrow, and Margaret exchanged a glance with Harold that suggested they weren't sure how to interpret Ellie's response. "Your current work?" Sarah asked carefully. "Are you still doing the freelance journalism?" "I am," Ellie confirmed. "But you said you were stable," Amanda said, clearly trying to reconcile Ellie's apparent confidence with what she understood about the precarious nature of freelance work. Before Ellie could explain further, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of someone who would change the entire dynamic of the family gathering. Dr. Catherine Morrison, BBC Radio's commissioning editor for social affairs programming, approached their group with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to navigating social events in search of specific individuals. "Excuse me," Catherine said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that immediately commanded attention. "I'm looking for Ellie Reid. I was told she might be here." The family members turned to stare at Ellie with expressions ranging from confusion to outright bewilderment. How did a BBC editor know Ellie would be at Julie's wedding? And why was she looking for her? "I'm Ellie Reid," Ellie said, extending her hand with the confidence of someone who'd grown accustomed to professional recognition. "Catherine Morrison, BBC Radio," Catherine said, shaking Ellie's hand warmly. "I've been following your work with Roar Voices for several months now. Your approach to covering women's career experiences is exactly what we need for a new series we're developing." The words hit the gathered family members like a physical shock. Uncle Harold's champagne glass paused halfway to his lips. Margaret's eyes widened with surprise. David looked like he was trying to solve a complex mathematical equation in his head. "BBC?" Julie whispered, her bride's composure momentarily forgotten. Catherine, oblivious to the family drama she'd just triggered, continued enthusiastically. "We're launching a 12-part series called Redefining Success that explores how different generations approach career planning and professional fulfillment. Your Roar Voices content is exactly the kind of authentic, research-based perspective we want to feature." "Roar Voices," Amanda repeated slowly, recognition dawning on her face. "Wait, you're the author of that article I was just telling everyone about. You're the one who wrote about family pressure and career expectations." "Among other things," Ellie said with a small smile. Catherine nodded approvingly. Ellie's built one of the most influential platforms in the UK for discussions about women's professional development. Her audience engagement metrics are extraordinary, and her content consistently goes viral among professional women. "Viral," Margaret repeated faintly, as if the word was in a foreign language. "The Forbes presentation was particularly impressive," Catherine continued. "Standing ovation, wasn't it? And the follow-up coverage in Harvard Business Review really established your credibility in this space." Harold looked like he was having difficulty processing the information he was receiving. "Forbes?" he managed to ask. "Harvard Business Review?" "Oh yes," Catherine said cheerfully. "Ellie's become quite the thought leader in discussions about authentic career development. The Roar Voices platform has been featured in major publications across Europe and North America." Simon, who'd been listening with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a complex legal brief, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion. Ellie is a freelance journalist. She doesn't run a platform." Catherine looked genuinely puzzled by the statement. Roar Voices is one of the most successful independent media companies focused on women's career issues. Ellie's built a team, developed multiple revenue streams, and created content that's influenced policy discussions at the governmental level. The silence that followed was so complete that even the background noise of wedding conversations seemed to fade away. Every face in the family circle was frozen in various expressions of shock, confusion, and dawning recognition that they'd fundamentally misunderstood Ellie's professional situation. "Ellie," her father's voice was barely audible. "Is this true?" "Which part?" Ellie asked gently. "The BBC series, the Forbes presentation, the art platform you've built?" "All of it," Ellie confirmed. Catherine, beginning to sense that she'd stumbled into some kind of family revelation, looked around the circle of stunned faces with growing awareness that her arrival had triggered something significant. "I hope I haven't interrupted anything important," she said diplomatically. "No," Ellie said quickly. "Nothing that can't wait. When did you want to discuss the BBC series?" "Actually," Catherine said, checking her watch, "I have a car waiting, and we could do a brief interview now if you're available. Just background for the series development. 20 minutes, perhaps." "Of course," Ellie agreed. As they walked away toward the hotel's quiet lobby area, leaving the family circle in stunned silence, Ellie could hear the whispered conversations beginning behind her. "Did she say Harvard Business Review?" That was David's voice. "Forbes presentation?" Margaret sounded completely bewildered. "How did we not know about any of this?" Harold's voice carried the tone of someone who prided himself on staying informed about family members' activities. 20 minutes later, Ellie returned to find her family members clustered together in intense discussion. The conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed her approach, and she found herself facing the same circle of relatives who'd staged their intervention 2 years earlier, but with entirely different expressions on their faces. "Ellie," her mother said slowly, "we need to talk." "Of course," Ellie agreed, settling into a chair that had been hastily arranged for her in the center of their impromptu family conference. "The BBC editor," Julie began carefully, "she said you run a media company?" "I do," Ellie confirmed. "With employees?" Marcus asked, his investment background evident in his focus on concrete business metrics. "4 full-time staff members and about a dozen regular freelance contributors," Ellie replied. Harold leaned forward with the intensity of someone trying to understand a financial statement that didn't match his expectations. "Ellie, when we talked 2 years ago, you were struggling to pay rent on a small flat." "I was," Ellie agreed. "And I used that struggle as motivation to build something better." "But how?" Sarah asked, her legal training evident in her need to understand the timeline and process. "How did you go from freelance journalism to running a successful media company in 2 years?" Ellie considered how much to explain, how much detail her family needed to understand her transformation. "I stopped treating my work like a hobby and started treating it like a business. I educated myself about digital media, audience development, and revenue creation. I identified an underserved market and created content that served that community exceptionally well." "What kind of revenue are we talking about?" David asked with the directness of someone who'd been trained to evaluate business propositions. "Enough to employ 4 people full-time and invest in continued growth," Ellie replied diplomatically. Margaret looked stunned. "Ellie, are you saying that your journalism work, the work we all thought was impractical, has become financially successful?" "More than successful." Catherine Morrison's voice came from behind them as she returned from her phone call. "Roar Voices is projected to reach 7 figures in annual revenue within the next 18 months. Ellie's built something quite remarkable." The number hit the family like a physical shock. 7 figures. £1 million revenue projections. From the niece they'd been trying to save from her impractical career choices. 7 figures, A. Harold repeated slowly, his banker's instincts automatically calculating what that meant in terms of profit margins, growth rates, and business valuation. The platform has attracted interest from several venture capital firms, A. Catherine added helpfully. Though I understand Ellie's been selective about funding opportunities to maintain editorial independence. Venture capital. Editorial independence. The terminology of serious business success applied to work they dismissed as glorified blogging just 2 years earlier. Ellie, her father's voice carried a mixture of pride and bewilderment that she'd never heard before. Why didn't you tell us? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications about family communication, trust, and the assumptions that had shaped their relationships for years. Because I wanted to know that you valued me for who I am. Not for what I've achieved, Ellie said simply. I wanted to know that your love and respect weren't contingent on conventional markers of success. The truth of that statement settled over them with uncomfortable clarity. They realized that their concern for Ellie's future had been less about her happiness and more about their own comfort with how her life appeared to external observers. We were wrong, Julie said quietly, her bride's confidence momentarily replaced by the vulnerability of someone recognizing a significant error in judgment. We were so focused on what success should look like that we missed what you were actually building. Uncle Harold shook his head slowly, the gesture of someone recalibrating his understanding of a situation he thought he'd analyzed correctly. Ellie, I offered you an entry-level position at the bank while you were building a £1 million media company. You were trying to help, Ellie said gently. You saw someone you loved struggling, and you wanted to provide a solution. That comes from a good place, even if the execution was misguided. Margaret reached over to take Ellie's hand, her touch gentle with newfound respect. Can you forgive us for being so narrow-minded? For trying to force you into our definition of what your life should look like? There's nothing to forgive, Ellie said, meaning it. Family means wanting the best for each other, even when we disagree about what best looks like. Catherine, who'd been listening to this family reconciliation with the interest of someone who understood human dynamics, stepped forward. If I may, she said diplomatically, Ellie's success story is exactly what we want to feature in the BBC series. The courage to pursue unconventional paths despite family pressure is something that resonates with millions of women. David looked thoughtful. So when we were all giving you advice about practical career choices, you were actually building exactly the kind of innovative business that I study in my consulting work. Innovation often looks like failure from the outside, Ellie agreed. Especially in the early stages when you're building something that doesn't fit existing categories. Marcus, his investment expertise finally catching up to the reality of Ellie's situation, asked the question that had been building throughout the conversation. Ellie, what's the company worth? Marcus, Margaret said quickly, that's not appropriate to ask. It's fine, Ellie said. Based on current revenue projections and industry valuations for similar platforms, somewhere between £8 and £12 million. The number created another moment of stunned silence. £8 to £12 million. Built from nothing over 2 years by the family member they'd been trying to save from her impractical career choices. £12 million, Harold repeated, his banking background automatically calculating what that meant in terms of personal wealth, tax implications, and investment opportunities. Sarah shook her head in amazement. Ellie, you've built something worth more than most of our combined net worth, and we've been lecturing you about financial planning. Success isn't a competition, Ellie reminded them. You've all built meaningful careers and comfortable lives. Different doesn't mean better or worse. But even as she spoke the words, Ellie felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with financial comparisons or family vindication. She'd proven to herself that her instincts had been correct, that the work she'd felt called to pursue was not only personally meaningful but also economically viable and socially important. Catherine checked her watch. I hate to interrupt this lovely family moment, but Ellie, we do need to finalize the details for the BBC series. Are you available for a longer conversation next week? Of course, Ellie agreed. Have your assistant contact Maria Santos, my operations manager. She handles my scheduling. Operations manager. The casual reference to having staff, to needing someone to manage her professional commitments, was another small indication of how completely Ellie's circumstances had changed. As Catherine departed, promising to be in touch about the BBC collaboration, the family circle reformed around Ellie with an entirely different energy than their previous interventions had carried. Ellie, her mother said softly, I feel like I don't know you at all. All these years we thought you were struggling, and you were actually building something extraordinary. I was struggling, Ellie clarified. But I was struggling toward something rather than struggling against something. That made all the difference. Her father looked at her with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time not the daughter who disappointed family expectations, but the entrepreneur who built something significant through vision, dedication, and remarkable courage. I'm proud of you, he said simply. Not because of the money or the recognition, but because you had the strength to believe in yourself when no one else did. The words meant more to Ellie than any external validation ever could. Her father's approval had been something she'd craved throughout her career struggles, and receiving it now felt like the completion of a circle that had been broken for too long. As the wedding celebration continued around them, the Reed family found themselves in the unusual position of having to reconsider their assumptions about success, achievement, and the value of unconventional career paths. They'd learned something important about the danger of measuring other people's lives by their own standards. But perhaps more significantly, they'd learned about the quiet power of persistence, about what could be accomplished when someone refused to accept external definitions of what their life should look like. Later that evening, as the wedding reception wound down and family members began to say their goodbyes, Ellie found herself standing on the hotel terrace overlooking the loch, watching the last light fade from the Scottish sky. Her uncle Harold joined her, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. For you, he said, offering her one of the glasses. A toast to success that comes in forms we don't always recognize. To family, Ellie countered, raising her glass. And to learning that love sometimes means supporting dreams we don't understand. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the stars begin to appear over the Highland landscape. Ellie, Harold said finally, I owe you an apology. A massive, comprehensive apology. You owe me nothing, Uncle Harold. You were worried about someone you loved. That's what families do. But we were so condescending, he insisted. So certain that we knew better than you did about your own life and capabilities. You knew what you knew, Ellie said simply. And I hadn't given you much reason to believe in my vision. From the outside, my career did look like a series of false starts and struggles. But you never gave up. Because I couldn't, Ellie replied. This work isn't just what I do. It's who I am. Even if Roar Voices had never become financially successful, I would have kept creating, kept telling these stories, kept building community around authentic conversations about women's experiences. Harold nodded thoughtfully. That's what we missed, isn't it? We were so focused on external measures of success that we didn't understand that your commitment came from something deeper than career ambition. Success is personal, Ellie agreed. For some people, it's climbing corporate ladders or building investment portfolios. For others, it's raising families or serving communities or mastering crafts. There's no universal definition. As they walked back toward the hotel, Harold stopped suddenly. Ellie, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you forgive us? For being so blind, so judgmental, so wrong about what you were capable of? Ellie considered the question seriously. The family intervention 2 years earlier had been painful and demoralizing. Their lack of faith in her vision had forced her to find strength and conviction she hadn't known she possessed. In many ways, their doubt had been as important to her eventual success as their current support was to her sense of family belonging. There's nothing to forgive, she said finally. You gave me something valuable, even if it wasn't what you intended. What did we give you? The motivation to prove that authentic success is possible, Ellie replied. And the knowledge that my achievements belong to me, not to anyone else's expectations. 3 months later, the BBC series Redefining Success premiered, with Ellie's story featured prominently in the opening episode. The programme explored how young professionals across the UK were building careers that prioritised personal fulfilment alongside financial security, challenging traditional assumptions about what constituted worthwhile work. Uncle Harold organised a family viewing party, proudly telling anyone who would listen about his niece who'd built a media empire while they'd all been trying to convince her to get a real job. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but it was delivered with such genuine pride and affection that Ellie found herself touched rather than vindicated. But the real satisfaction came not from family recognition or media attention, but from the emails and messages that poured in from Raw Voices readers who'd seen the BBC programme and felt inspired to pursue their own authentic career paths despite external pressure to conform. A year later, Ellie received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during her days as a struggling freelancer. Harvard Business School wanted her to deliver a guest lecture about building mission-driven media companies in the digital age. Standing in that legendary lecture hall, addressing MBA students who represented the pinnacle of conventional business education, Ellie reflected on the journey that had brought her from family disappointment to recognized thought leader. Success, she told the Harvard students, isn't about meeting other people's expectations. It's about having the courage to pursue work that matters to you, even when that work doesn't fit existing categories or traditional definitions of achievement. She paused, looking out at the eager faces of young people who were preparing to enter careers that would likely follow conventional paths toward conventional success. The most important thing I've learned, as she continued, is that quiet persistence often achieves more than loud ambition. When you build something authentic, something that serves others while honoring your own values, the recognition and financial success follow naturally. As she concluded her presentation to enthusiastic applause, Ellie thought about her family, who'd learned to celebrate achievements they didn't initially understand, and about the thousands of women who'd found community and inspiration through Raw Voices. The girl who'd once felt like a failure for refusing conventional career paths had become a woman who'd proven that authentic success was not only possible but more fulfilling than any external validation could ever be. The quiet victory was indeed the strongest. Because dignity doesn't need to shout. It simply stands firm, and eventually, the world recognizes its worth.